And thank you so much for joining this Zoom webinar on social engineering. Today, we're going to be discussing how criminals exploit human behavior and how to protect your computer and company from intrusion. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you have trouble with audio access, please use the chat button, and I will be on the back end of this, and I'll do what I can to help you along. I'd like to now introduce Clay Blankenship from Ankura, and he will begin introducing himself and we'll move through the webinar. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Clay Blankenship. I'm a managing director with Ankura Consulting. A little bit about myself. I'm retired law enforcement. I had 22 years. My last 7 were in the cybercrime unit, where I created the cybercrime unit and stood up the digital forensics lab. Investigated anything that was cyber related in law enforcement. I made the bounce to incident response in the corporate world, where I went to work for IBM on their global incident response team, and then was later hired by Navigant Consulting, which was then purchased by Ankura. So I've been here for about 3 years. Got a wide range of experience dealing with computer forensics and incident response. Investigated anything from gang activity, homicides, network intrusions, ransomware, email compromise, a number of different cases. And I'm also a digital forensics instructor. A little bit about Ankura. We are a 1,400 plus professional consulting firm. We have offices throughout the world, primarily United States, but we have offices in London, Hong Kong, building one up in Australia, a couple other places. I'm part of the cybersecurity division, and we have about 100 professionals in that division, which encompass digital forensics, incident response, e-discovery, data analytics, and our proactive services, of course, where they do incident response plans, cybersecurity assessments, and things like that. So I'd like to flip it over to Brian, let him introduce himself and KMRD.
Thanks, Clay. I'm Brian Yoon with KMRD, one of the partners here, and not as exciting of a background as Clay for sure when you talk about insurance, but we have 14 years in the insurance and brokerage business, and have a CIC designation. We like to hold ourselves out as an extension of our clients' management team by providing outsourced risk management to our customers. A little bit about KMRD. We are a regional boutique firm out of Warrington, Pennsylvania. We have 3 offices in Pennsylvania, and we frequently act as not only support, but act as a risk management department for our clients, not only in insurance placement, but contractual risk transfer and claims management. Insurance is the most expensive way to transfer risk, and we like to spend a lot of our time in the other manners and the other ways that we can help our customers transfer or deflect risk from their business.
Great, thanks, Brian. So this is Clay again. We'll talk about the agenda today. We're going to talk to you a little bit about what social engineering is, the different types of social engineering attacks that can occur, and a little bit about on how to protect yourself from those. And then we'll flip it over to Brian, where he's going to talk about the insurance angle of that and the assessments. So what is social engineering? When we talk about social engineering, we're referring to the information gathering. I mean, that's the best way to put it. And this can either be done by you providing it, by somebody tricking you into providing it, or you just posting it up. When I was in law enforcement, we used social engineering for a lot of things. When I worked undercover narcotics, we used social engineering to find known associates, find where people were hanging out at, and find family members. So if we knew somebody was wanted, we knew where to go look for them, probably at their family member's house. When I started getting into the digital forensics world, we started using that to crack passwords on when people had password protected files. Bad guys got his nefarious files locked up where he thinks that they're protected. Usually people are creatures of habits. They'll use dates of birth in their passwords, or their names of their spouses, their children, their pets. My mom is notorious for that. I can social engineer my mom's passwords in a minute because I know she always uses her maiden name and her birthday. So I know it's going to be some iteration of that. Cyber criminals, just like with any other tool, they can use something that is typically used for good. They can turn it around and use it for bad. And so they use social engineering to gain access to your network. So the types of things, unwitting persons, that's when you just automatically give up, or you're tricked into giving up that information. One of the easiest ways to gather information is social media. If you can go look at anybody's Facebook page that you know, and people are posting all kinds of personal information on there. Their birthdays. How many friends do you have that pop up says the birthday is today? I don't put my birthday on there because I know that people can use that. Dating sites and even LinkedIn. A lot of cyber criminals will browse LinkedIn and gather a lot of data for their phishing attacks. Or they could actually use previously compromised business contacts or other entities. We see this a lot with email compromise cases. So the different types of social engineering that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about baiting, phishing and spear phishing, vishing, and if you don't know what these are, I'm going to tell you and explain what they are. Some tailgating, pretexting, and quid pro quo. Everybody should know what that is by now based on the news stories. Baiting, this is, think of if you're going on a fishing trip and you have this brand new shiny lure. That lure is the bait, and you throw it out and expect the fish to grab that. So people are like fish. You can do this as an example. Take a flashy USB, like a gold or silver USB drive, and just throw it at the front door of your office and see who picks it up. I can guarantee you that somebody eventually is going to stick that into the computer because people are curious. So criminals will do this. They will take that USB flash drive. They'll put some malware on it that is usually an auto start malware. They'll plug it into the machine, or they'll load it onto there and expect somebody to pick it up, walk into their business, and drop that onto there. Or they may put some malicious documents on there with an enticing name, something that would make you look, something like a pay raise PDF or something like that. So inevitably, somebody is going to click on it. People are creatures of habits. They're curious. They want to see it. So ways to reduce that is end user education, and you're going to see that a lot. End user education is probably the most effective way to prevent a lot of these attacks. Up-to-date antivirus. Antivirus is a great tool, and it is something you should have in your environment. But again, it's only good for what came out yesterday or what it can see heuristically. But there's a lot of new malware out there that just doesn't get detected. Limit user privileges. We don't want to give somebody administrative rights to a computer if they don't need it, because then if their account is compromised, then the bad guy has access to it. Disable block macros. You'll see that a lot. Malware is built into a Word document, and it needs those macros in order to execute. So if you're blocking macros, that's a level of protection. Disable auto runs. And another way is don't allow external USB devices. You can set that, as a security policy to not allow external devices. That's pretty extreme, but if this scares you, then that may be a way to do it. Phishing and spear phishing. This is probably one of the most common tactics used by cyber criminals. We always warn about this. I don't know how many times I've been through the mandatory training on the mandatory security training that our company provides, and I've seen other companies provide it as well. But the human factor is just something you can't always fix. So people, again, they're curious. So the threat actor, he's going to create his email. It's going to look legitimate, and it's going to look like it came from a trusted source. And the goal is to get you to click on the link or open something so that malware gets dropped on the system. And I'm going to show you some real world examples. So here is an example of a fake Office 365. Now, this was actually a real email. I've changed the names to protect the innocent, of course. But I've also, boxed out some things that you can easily look for to identify this as fake. This did not come from Outlook, as you see from the return address. The common misspellings, and this thing that says validate your email, they'll really won't ever ask you to do that. And the other thing is you can right click and hover over that, click here to validate and look at the hyperlink and see what it says. If it's not a Microsoft or your own company actual address, it's probably not legitimate. So here is another example of if you get a fake DocuSign link. Again, one of the things to look for here is that address bar. I mean, that is a red flag right there. But this attacker was also nice enough to give you an option of what email platform you use, so that when we go to the next page, you'll see why. So in this particular instance, I selected Office 365. So when I clicked on that, I'm presented with the web page, a login page that looks just like an Office 365 login page. But again, the address bar should be a clue. But here you would enter your email address and your password and click that sign in, and that would send those credentials to the attacker, and then he would have access to the email account. So how to reduce the risks in this? Again, end user education. That's the best way. Using strong email filters, keeping your antivirus up to date, and again, limit your user privileges and disable and block macros. Vishing, this is the voice version of phishing. You'll see this, everybody gets those calls. I mean, I could ask you guys to throw up your hand here and say, who gets those fake Microsoft support calls? I get them all the time. I have a virtual machine with an FBI logo on the back. So I actually will boot up the VM and give them access and then yell at them, I got you now, and then they hang up. So just a little fun that I have. So to reduce the risk of this, again, end user education. Microsoft's not going to call you. The IRS is not going to call you. So teach people this. And fake tech support, we see that all the time. So, train your people who your real tech support are. And again, limit your user privileges on that as well. Pretexting. Pretexting is actually a subcategory of vishing or phishing. And to give a real world example of this, when I worked for IBM, we had a client who had a large bank transaction go through. They just didn't know how it happened. So we started looking at the user's computer, and we found that they were infected with Dridex. And that what Dridex did at that time, this was several years ago, is it injected code into the web browser. So when you went to a banking website, and it was one of the banks that this malware knew about, it would inject a little pop-up window that said, call this number to validate your account. You call that number, somebody answers, they're posing as the bank employee, and they trick you into giving up your login credentials. So then that guy can go in and do the large transfer. So again, you're going to, again, common things, employee education and limit user privileges. Tailgating, I don't know how many times I've seen this. I've been on client sites on many occasions and just been able to follow people in, especially if we're there for an assessment or something. We can just walk right in, do what we want. They could pose as a packet FedEx delivery or food delivery and just walk right on in, and people leave their computers open and passwords written down on the desk, and these bad guys can just get it. So some of the things to reduce the risk here is employee education, keep the unattended systems locked, limit your user privileges, keep your antivirus updated, disable your auto runs, and of course don't allow USB drives because we don't want the bad guy walking in the building and sticking in his own USB drive. Quid pro quo, that occurs when the threat actor requests confidential information in exchange for something else. So somebody's not going to give you a cruise in exchange for a password. So if it's too good to be true, remember it probably is. So again, employee education and limit user privileges. That's the best way you can prevent most of this. I'm going to flip it over to Brian now so that he can talk about his part. Brian, you on mute?
Sorry, thanks, Clay. As Clay discussed, there are lots of different social engineering schemes. However, today's most prevalent reason is to gain funds or money. And so we're going to talk a little bit about where the coverage is in your policies. If you buy, a lot of our clients say, well, don't I buy a property policy for damage to our network or theft of funds? And that's not typically the case. So from a coverage perspective, buying social engineering, you can do it in several different ways. Kidnap and ransom, sometimes on really large global properties, you'll see some cyber coverage or privacy coverage, which also includes social engineering. However, most likely you're going to see it on crime and cyber policies. And the coverage for both of these policies, in particular cyber, is changing drastically and very quickly. Coverage looked different than it did 12 months ago, and that's how quickly it's moving. Just to give you an example of the growth in funds transfer fraud, so a Microtrend report suggested that $9 billion of estimated reported losses in 2018. Just to give you a guesstimate of the growth in this issue is $3 billion from 2013 to 2017. So a 3x jump in basically 1 year. So the legal landscape is also changing for this type of coverage, and Michigan and New York, perhaps not surprisingly, are leading the way in whether they are considering a direct loss as whether the computer fraud crime triggered or happened and proximate cause of the fraud to a computer system. And so these are even more reasons that you want to make sure that you're identifying the proper coverage, whether it's crime or your social engineering coverage. You can go to the next slide. So put together a little chart here of some of the pros from putting social engineering insurance coverage and paying for funds transfer type fraud on a cyber policy. The cyber policy's claim trigger is a fraudulent instruction versus, as we talked about before, a direct proximate cause of loss for a computer fraud in a crime policy. The cyber policies typically have a demand for cryptocurrency, which is important. A crime policy trigger may require demand of monies or securities. That's an important distinction. Typically, you're not going to find any voluntary parting, which means you voluntarily gave somebody funds because they asked for it or tricked you into it. And where a crime policy may include that type of exclusion. Cyber policies, social engineering events can include loss of data, not just loss of money and securities. So that's a pro to have this type of coverage where somebody might try to steal data rather than funds. From a cons perspective, you've got crime policies include erroneous transfer, which is where employees actually make a mistake. So they put in a wrong routing number, and that's what triggers the loss. And that would be something that would be found on a crime policy, but perhaps not a cyber policy. Third-party coverage, cyber policy is only going to cover loss of money if it's the insured, the person on the policy or who bought the policy. Crime policy, there's options to add agents coverage for third parties holding money. I'd like you to think of a payroll company. Payroll company might be withholding tax dollars and on your behalf, and they may withhold it for a month and then make those payments on your behalf. Anybody who is prepaid freight, perhaps, anyone who is holding your money in advance, that's something that you can get with some underwriting on a crime policy, and you're not going to get on a cyber policy. Some policies require authentications of funds. I just read a program of a fairly large organization where they are required to authenticate the request. Well, that kind of eliminates the reason why you should buy a cyber policy for computer fraud coverage, in my opinion. The advent of more regulation, you've got, the Nevada, California version of GDPR. That certainly could dilute cyber limits as coverage continues to evolve and claims continue to evolve. And that would be, one of the cons of putting it on a social engineering policy. And then finally, you may not be able to buy high enough limits for fraud coverage on a cyber policy, whereas a crime policy, typically you can if you spend the money. The one key is when you're looking at your broker to make sure that you have perhaps both of these important coverages for crime or cyber, is you need to coordinate the other insurance clause. Once again, I just read another potential client's policy a couple of weeks ago, and both policies were listed as, in the event of other insurance in a claim, we are excess. Well, that's a problem because you're going to get the Bugs Bunny point in event of a claim. Carrier A is going to point to carrier B and vice versa, and you don't want that. If you don't buy coverage today, I would highly recommend at the very least that you fill out an application for coverage. Typically, there's about a 3-page application that you need to go through, and they ask a series of questions about your infrastructure. And just filling out the application and learning a little bit about your infrastructure and your network will certainly provide you some insights as to just how well protected you think you are versus what the norms are. And just because you're not doing every single best practice or you answer a no on that application doesn't mean that you will be turned down automatically for insurance coverage. It just is a means to underwrite the program. If you don't buy coverage today, I suspect costs are going to double in the next 5 years because of the claim activity. Chubb was in our office the other day, and they're one of the leading providers, and their loss ratio is approximately 50%. So they're still making money today. I have a feeling that things are going to change in the next 5 years. We can go to the next slide. One of the things that we did with Ancura and a A-rated player in the insurance space for cyber, we've partnered with all 3 entities to offer our clients up to a 20% discount off of their cyber insurance. We do an assessment, or I should say Ancura does an assessment that identifies critical vulnerabilities within the network, policies and procedures. And if you just by going through the assessment process, the insurance company will give you a 5% discount off of your policy if you are able to remediate the critical vulnerabilities, only the critical, because Ancura might list, 5 critical recommendations and they may have 15 others, but only the critical recommendations, if those are fixed, the carrier is willing to extend an additional 15%, so a total of 20%. There's no program like this in the marketplace today. You also, on top of that, you get a pre-negotiated policy coverage form with enhancements that took approximately 9 months to get. So once again, coverage is evolving, but this is a real benefit to address any potential vulnerabilities. You get pre-negotiated coverage at a discounted rate.